Dozens of Indigenous artifacts released from the Vatican collection are set to arrive in Canada today. Canadian Culture Minister Mark Miller will join First Nations, Inuit and Métis leaders at Montreal's airport today to welcome the items. Indigenous leaders have long called on the Vatican to return Indigenous items in their collection. Representatives spoke with Pope Francis about it in 2022 when they met him in Rome to discuss the legacy of church-run residential schools. Joining me now is Neil MacCarthy, spokesperson for the Archdiocese of Toronto. Thank you for joining me this morning, sir.
Nice to be with you.
So talk to us about what will happen once these artifacts arrive in Montreal today. Who is supposed to oversee the care of the items and transfer them?
Well, representatives from the Indigenous communities will be present and have been accompanying the artifacts during their travels. They'll be there when they arrive in Montreal, and then they'll be handed over to the Canadian Museum of History in Gatineau, Quebec. They'll take an opportunity to kind of, register, if you will, the items, examine them, help acclimatize them to the Canadian climate because they've been over in Europe for many years. And then the Indigenous leaders themselves will be talking about how they will be receiving those items, where they will go, where they may be displayed in the future. But really, that's their prerogative in terms of how they move forward and where they decide they will be.
So as you mentioned, there are several processes that these items need to go through once they arrive. Can you elaborate on the preservation, cataloging, and the verification processes that will be in place to ensure they return to their respective Indigenous communities?
Well, I think if we go back a few years, I was part of that group in 2022 that was accompanying the representatives from residential schools, elders, young people, knowledge keepers. And at that point, they had a chance to first see some of those items. And that began the discussions of, are we able to bring some of those items back to Canada? The Vatican has cataloged those items and dates their history back. Part of, I think, the delay in getting them back here in 2025 is just to try to trace the origin and really identify whether those items were gifts or whether they were brought over not necessarily with the consent or understanding of the Indigenous community. So they've identified those 62 items. They will come back, and they've also identified whether the heritage is Inuit, First Nations, or Métis. Each of those communities have items as part of the 62, and then those Indigenous communities themselves will ultimately decide where those are housed.
What does this move say about the Vatican's efforts to help the Church achieve reconciliation with Indigenous communities here in Canada?
Well, I think this is a very significant step in the healing reconciliation process. We saw in 2022 the delegation that went over and first kind of made that request to say, we'd like to have these items returned to Canada. The Pope took this very seriously. Not only did he apologize as part of their visit, just a few months later, Pope Francis came to Canada himself, and that conversation about these artifacts continued. Took a little, probably longer than everybody would have hoped, but these are artifacts that have been there for literally over 100 years, and so to get it right, to make sure that items are in good condition and that the right items were coming back to Canada, took a little bit of time, and we're seeing the fruits of that work today. Pope Leo obviously continuing in that legacy of Pope Francis to say we want them to come back, and it's happening today. It's a very powerful moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil. That is Neil MacCarthy, the spokesperson for the Archdiocese of Toronto.